He stood at the door of a house so small it could have fit inside his boardroom. The number painted on the rusted gate was almost gone, faded by Harmattan winds and years of rain, but it was the right number. He had checked it 3 times on the piece of paper his driver had handed him. The street smelled of wood smoke and frying plantain and something sweet and rotting he could not name. A goat was tied to a pole 2 doors down, and it looked at him with the calm, ancient eyes of a creature that had seen everything and was no longer surprised by any of it. He had not told anyone he was coming here. Not his personal assistant. Not his head of security. Not his driver, who he had sent away at the end of the road and told to return in 1 hour. He had walked the last 5 minutes on a road where the potholes were so deep and so many that the road itself was more hole than road, and his leather shoes that cost more than some people in the street earned in a year, were already coated in red dust. He raised his hand to knock, and then he heard it. A voice, small, thin, barely above a whisper, coming from inside the house, singing. He lowered his hand. He stood very still and he listened. And what he heard in the next 60 seconds dismantled something in his chest that he had spent 38 years carefully constructing. He had come here to let her go, to put an envelope under the door and walk away, to end a chapter quietly and cleanly the way he ended every chapter of his life. Efficiently, without sentimentality, without looking back. He did not walk away. He stood at that gate with red dust on his shoes and the sound of a small voice singing inside a small house, and something in him that had been locked for a very long time slowly, painfully, quietly opened. This is a story about what a man saw when he looked somewhere he had never thought to look, and how seeing it cost him everything he thought he was, and gave him back something he did not know he had lost. His name was Emeka Olusegun Adeyemi, and from the outside, from any angle the outside offered, his life was exactly what success was supposed to look like. He was 41 years old. He owned a construction and infrastructure group that had built roads, bridges, hospitals, and commercial towers across 6 states. His company employed over 2,000 people. His name appeared on lists. His photograph appeared in magazines. His opinion was sought by men who ran governments. He owned a house in the kind of neighborhood where the roads were smooth, the walls were high, the generators were silent, and nothing outside your gate could reach you unless you opened it yourself. He had married at 32. His wife's name was Saad Oluwade Adeyemi, née Bankole, and she was the kind of beautiful that makes other people in a room forget what they were saying. She had a degree in architecture, a laugh that arrived like something breaking open, and a way of standing in a room that made the room feel chosen. They had been introduced at a mutual friend's function. He had looked at her from across a room where expensive things and expensive people were arranged decoratively around each other, and something in him had recognized something in her the way a key recognizes a lock. They had a daughter named Adiz, named after his own mother, Adiz Adeyemi, who had died 3 years before the wedding and who he still spoke to in the quiet of cars, when he was alone. Their daughter was 5 years old. She had her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness and a habit of narrating everything she was doing as she did it, so that walking through a room she occupied was like entering a small person's ongoing commentary on the universe. Chidinma had been working in their house for 6 years. Her full name was Chidinma Okonkwo. She had come to them through a relative of a relative, the kind of arrangement that is not quite a reference and not quite a recommendation but sits somewhere between them, held together by the quiet pressure of family obligation. She was 26 when she arrived. She was 32 now. She had spent 6 years washing, ironing, sweeping, cooking, and caring for a child who was not hers in a house that was not hers in a life that she had shaped entirely around someone else's comfort. She was quiet in the way that some people are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they have learned very early that their saying of things does not change the things that are said. She moved through the house with a particular economy of motion, the way people move through a space when they are always aware of exactly how much of it belongs to them. She kept her living quarters, a room at the back of the house behind the kitchen with a single window that faced the generator, immaculately ordered. Her few things were few and arranged. Her Bible was on the small wooden table by her bed. On the wall above it was a photograph of a woman who must have been her mother and 2 small children who must have been her siblings. Emeka had lived in the same house as Chidinma for 6 years, and he could not have told you those details. He could not have told you that she got up every morning at 5:15, before the first sound of anyone else stirring. He could not have told you that she made a cup of tea each morning and stood at the kitchen window and watched the sky change from black to gray to pale gold before the day began. He could not have told you that she sent half of every month's salary back to a town several hours north, where her widowed mother was raising the two siblings in the photograph on the wall, one of whom was in secondary school and one of whom had needed an operation on a knee 2 years ago that Chidinma had paid for by borrowing from a colleague and repaying in installments that took 11 months. He could not have told you any of this because he had never thought to ask. She had been background. She had been part of the smooth functioning of his life the way the generator and the borehole and the security cameras were part of the smooth functioning of his life. Present. Necessary. Essentially invisible. And then, 8 months before he stood outside her gate with red dust on his shoes, everything in his life began to change. The first sign was small. The kind of small thing that would not have registered as a sign at all if later events had not cast it backwards in significance. He had come home late on a Tuesday. A site inspection that ran into a contractor meeting that ran into a dinner he could not avoid. He had come through the front door at nearly midnight, loosening his tie in the corridor, and he had seen a light on in the kitchen. He had walked toward it without thinking, the way you walk toward light. Chidinma was at the kitchen counter. She did not hear him come in because she had earphones in. She was standing very still, doing nothing. No work, no cooking, nothing. Just standing with her hands flat on the counter and her head bowed and her shoulders moving in a rhythm that was not music. She was crying. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just quietly, steadily, with her shoulders moving and her hands flat on the counter and the light above her making everything very clear. He stopped in the corridor doorway. She had not heard him. He stood there for perhaps 20 seconds, watching a woman cry alone in his kitchen at midnight. He felt something he could not name. Not quite discomfort. Not quite shame. Something that occupied the space between them. Then he went to bed. He did not check on her. He did not ask. In the morning she was up before him as always and the kitchen was clean as always, and she brought him his coffee without being asked as always, and he said thank you as always, and that was the end of it. Except it was not the end of it. The image stayed. The bowed head. The flat hands. The shoulders. He found himself noticing things he had not noticed before. That she ate after everyone else, always. That her shoes were cracked at the heel and had been cracked at the heel for a long time. That there was a particular expression she had when his wife spoke to her sharply. Not hurt, not anger, just a kind of quiet absorption, like a surface receiving weather. That she had been sleeping with a blanket in June because the air conditioning in her room had broken in April and no one had arranged to fix it. He arranged to have it fixed. He did not say why. He told his property manager to check all the rooms including staff quarters. A week later the technician came and Chidinma's unit was replaced. She said thank you to the property manager. She did not say anything to him because she did not know it had come from him. He could not have explained even to himself why he had done it the way he did it. The second sign was not small. His wife had always been able to spend money with the kind of fluency that suggested money had never been difficult for her, which it had not. She had grown up in a household where the car was changed every 2 years and the house in which she grew up still stood in a part of the city where the trees were old and the silence was expensive. She had an instinct for beauty. She could walk into a room and immediately understand what it lacked and exactly how much the lacking of it would cost to fix. Their house was a testimony to this instinct. Every surface considered. Every object chosen. A house that knew exactly what it was. What he began to notice, gradually, reluctantly, was that his wife had a second fluency. An equal and opposite instinct. For diminishment. It operated on Chidinma like a steady, quiet pressure. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that would look like anything from the outside. Just the accumulated weight of small things over time. The tone. A word chosen when a softer word was available. An instruction given in front of guests that did not need to be given in front of guests. A mistake made public when it could have been addressed privately. The kind of behavior that, taken in isolation, means nothing, but taken together across years forms a shape that is recognizable if you are willing to recognize it. He had not been willing to recognize it for 6 years. He recognized it now. and recognizing it made him uncomfortable in a way he could not discharge. Because recognizing it also meant recognizing that he had been present for it. That his house and his authority had been the container in which it happened. That his inattention had been, in its own quiet way, its own kind of permission. He did not say any of this to his wife. He did not say anything at all. He simply began to pay attention. Paying attention is a dangerous occupation in a house where people have agreed, through long habit, not to see too clearly. What he saw once he started looking was this. Chidinma sent money home every month. He knew this because his wife had mentioned it once in a tone that suggested it was evidence of financial irresponsibility. She has people at home she is always giving money to, and he had registered it at the time as background information without processing what it actually meant. What it meant, he now understood, was that she was maintaining a household on a domestic worker's salary. That the salary they paid her, which he had set 6 years ago and not revisited, because it had never occurred to him to revisit it, had not increased in those 6 years even as everything around it had increased. The cost of food, the cost of transport, the cost of everything a family needs to survive. All of it had increased. Her salary had not. He looked into this. He asked his personal assistant, quietly, to pull the household staff records. He sat in his office on a Tuesday afternoon and he read through 6 years of payroll for a woman who had worked in his house since before his daughter was born, and he felt something begin to go wrong in his chest. Not guilt yet, not quite, but the thing that comes before guilt. The thing that has not yet decided what it wants to be. She had never asked for a raise. Not once. Not even when the cost of her mother's treatment had required her to borrow. Not even when her brother's school fees went up. Not even when the economy pressed down on everyone and the naira lost its footing and everything that cost 1,000 suddenly cost 2,000. She had not asked. He raised her salary immediately. He backdated it 3 months. He did not call her in to tell her. He simply arranged with his accountant to deposit the corrected figure and the back pay into her account on the next payment cycle. When the payment came through, she came to find him in his study. She stood at the door holding her phone, and she said, with a careful quietness that he now understood was not deference but self-protection, that she thought there had been an error in her salary. He told her there was no error. She stood at the door for a moment longer. He watched her absorb this information. She pressed her lips together once, very briefly, and then she said, in a voice that was completely level, "Thank you, sir." She turned and walked away down the corridor, and he sat in his chair and he thought about the 6 years she had said thank you for less than she was owed. The third thing, Adiz, his daughter, his 5-year-old daughter with her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, had begun calling Chidinma by a name he had not heard before. Not Auntie Chidinma, which is what children in that house called her. Something else. Something that, the first time he caught it, made him stop in the corridor outside the living room and stand very still. She called her Mama Chi. Not to cause confusion. Children are more precise than adults about these things. She knew who her mother was, but she had given Chidinma a name that expressed something. A particular kind of belonging, a claim of closeness, and Chidinma, every time she heard it, would get a particular expression on her face. A brief opening like a window letting in air. Then she would answer to the name without comment, without correction, without encouraging it and without stopping it. He watched this from corridors and doorways more times than he could count. He watched his daughter run to Chidinma with scraped knees and frightening dreams and the afternoon sadness that children sometimes have without knowing why. He watched Chidinma hold her. Not the efficient, professional comfort of an employee managing a child. Something else. Something with weight in it. He thought about his wife who loved their daughter. He did not doubt this, but who loved her from a particular distance. Who was excellent at the presentation of love. Who bought the right things and arranged the right things and photographed the right moments. Who was not, in the ordinary unremarkable minutes of a day, the person a 5-year-old ran to with a scraped knee. He was not sure what to do with what he was seeing. He was not sure he was entitled to feel what he was feeling about it. He put it in the same place he put everything he could not yet process, behind the part of himself he had trained, across a lifetime of ambition and forward motion, not to look at too carefully. The unraveling, when it came, did not arrive the way unravelings do in stories. Not dramatically. Not with a door slammed and a secret shouted. It arrived the way the rains arrive at the end of a long dry season. First a smell in the air, then a distant sound, then a darkness gathering at the edges of the sky, and then, before you have quite prepared yourself, you are standing in it. He came home one afternoon unexpectedly. A meeting cancelled. A rare gap in a schedule that was never meant to have gaps. He came through the gate and parked and walked through the front door, and the house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when everyone in them believes no one else is home. He went to the kitchen for water. He passed the half-open door of the small prayer room, a converted storeroom at the end of the corridor that his wife had commissioned a decorator to tile and fit with cushions and a cross and certain objects of devotion that had more to do with aesthetics than with prayer. He glanced in. His wife was in the room. She was not praying. She was sitting on the tiled floor with her back against the wall and her legs stretched out and her phone in her hand. And she was laughing at something on the phone with the full, uninhibited laugh he remembered from when they first met. The laugh that arrived like something breaking open. It was directed at something on the screen, and at the same time it was very clearly, very unmistakably directed at a person. A specific person. The kind of laugh you only have for one kind of person. He stood outside the half-open door. He did not announce himself. He stood there and he listened to the texture of his wife's laughter, and something in him simply became very still. Not the stillness of shock. The other kind. The kind that happens when a thing you have been refusing to know finally arrives at a place in you where you can no longer refuse it. He went upstairs. He sat in the chair by the window of his bedroom and he looked at the wall, and he did not start any of the engines in himself that he usually used to convert difficult feeling into action. He just sat. For a long time, while the afternoon light moved across the floor from one side to the other and then began to go orange and then gray. His wife came upstairs at 6. She saw him in the chair and she registered something in his face because she stopped at the door and her own face did something brief and involuntary. He did not say anything. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, in a voice so level it sounded like a different person's voice, "Are you well?" She said, "Yes, why?" He said, "You were laughing." "I heard you." She said, "Oh, I was on a call with Kemi. She was telling me something funny." He looked at her for another moment. He said, "Good." And that was all. But they both knew. In the weeks that followed, the house became a performance. Not an unpleasant one from the outside. From the outside it was the same as it had always been. Smooth surfaces. Considered objects. A 5-year-old narrating the universe and running to Chidinma with scraped knees, and a woman who moved through the rooms she cleaned with that particular economy of motion. But underneath the performance, things were happening. Conversations between husband and wife that occupied the surface of language while something else conducted itself beneath. Glances that carried information too large for words. The particular silence that falls between two people who have agreed, tacitly, not yet, and who are both filling their days with the business of not yet while whatever this is collects weight. He threw himself into work in the way that men who are avoiding their interior lives throw themselves into work, completely, expertly, with genuine achievement. He was on site more. He was in meetings more. He was visible in his professional life in a way that required him to be invisible in his personal one. And he came home later and later. And when he came home late, there was always a plate kept for him in the kitchen. And the plate was never done by his wife. He began to stop in the kitchen when he came home. To eat at the kitchen table instead of taking the plate to the dining room. It was late, he told himself. The dining room was unnecessary at that hour. This was practical. Chidinma was usually cleaning up when he arrived. She would finish what she was doing, and she would leave him to his late meal, and once or twice she stayed to wash the things still in the sink, and they were in the same room together in the late quiet of the house, and he found he could breathe in a way he had not been breathing in the brightly lit, carefully arranged rooms of the rest of his life. They talked. Not about anything significant at first. About his daughter, what she had done that day, what she had said, what new piece of the universe she had narrated. He found he could listen to these accounts with an attention he could not quite manage in other parts of his life. Chidinma spoke about Adiz with a love so matter-of-fact it was more convincing than declarations. Not "look how much I love this child." Just the specifics. The particular thing the child had said. The particular look on her face when she said it. He asked one evening about her family. He asked the way you ask when you already know you are going to hear something you are not prepared for. She told him about her mother, about the town several hours north, about her siblings, her brother in his final year of secondary school, top of his class, needing to sit exams that cost money he did not have, and her sister who was 17 and brilliant and already being pressured by an uncle to marry a man in the area because the uncle believed and said freely and often that education past a certain age was wasted on a girl. He listened. He ate. She washed the last of the things in the sink. He listened. He asked how long she had been managing this. She said 6 years. She said it quietly, without emphasis, the way you state a fact that is simply a fact. He said nothing. He looked at his plate. She dried the last dish and put it in the cupboard and said good night and left. He sat alone in the kitchen for a long time. He told his wife he wanted a divorce. He did not say it dramatically. He said it the way he said things that had already been decided, clearly, without theater. He said it one morning while they were both in the bedroom, before the day's performance had begun, while the early light was gray and the house was still and Adiz was still sleeping in her room. His wife sat on the edge of the bed for a long moment. She did not cry. She was not that kind of woman, not in the sense of being cold, but in the sense that her first response to difficulty was always architectural. She arranged her face and her posture before she arranged her response. She asked if this was about the phone call. He said it was about many things. The phone call had simply given him permission to see clearly. She looked at him. Then she looked away. Then she said, "What do you want?" He said he wanted their daughter to be loved the way she deserved to be loved. By both of them. Together in the same place if they could manage it, or separately if they could not. But consistently, attentively, in the specific way she needed and not in the way that photographed well. She looked at him again. And for the first time in months her face did something unrehearsed. A brief, complicated movement. Not quite sorrow, not quite relief. Something that did not have a clean name. She said, "I know you are right." He had not expected that. They sat in the gray morning light and they said some things to each other that had needed to be said for years and that neither of them had had the courage to say until this particular morning. They were not cruel. They were honest. And honest was harder than cruel in many ways because it required them to take responsibility for their own parts in what had become of this life they had built together. By the time Adiz padded into the room in her pajamas narrating the fact that she had woken up and it was morning and she was hungry, her parents were sitting on the bed, not touching, but occupying the same silence with something that resembled peace. He looked at his daughter and he thought about all the things she would feel as her world changed shape around her, and he felt the particular weight of knowing that there is no way to protect your child from everything and that trying to protect them from everything is its own kind of harm. What happened next happened in stages over many months, and each stage had its own particular texture. The separation. The careful arrangement of two lives that had been tangled in the same house and now needed to be untangled without destroying what could not be replaced. He moved to an apartment. Not far. They had agreed that Adiz would not lose the familiarity of her street, her school, the particular goings-on of her daily life. He was 20 minutes away. He was present more than he had ever been present when he lived in the house, because presence, when it is deliberate, is a different thing from presence that is merely physical. His wife Saad entered a period of her own reckoning. He did not follow her through it closely because it was not his to follow. He knew from his daughter's accounts and from the occasional conversation he and Saad had, careful, adult conversations conducted across the new landscape of their situation, that she was doing the difficult work of looking at herself without the architecture. That she was arriving at certain truths about herself with the particular discomfort of late arrival. He respected this. He had his own version of it. Chidinma. He had said nothing to her about any of this. She had been professional, as always. She had continued to care for his daughter with the same matter-of-fact love. The house was being managed in the transition. He had arranged that his wife remain in the main house with Adiz, and that Chidinma continue in her role for the time being, at his daughter's request. Adiz had made it very clear, with all the authority of a 5-year-old who has not yet been told that her authority is limited, that Mama Chi was not going anywhere. But things shifted, as things do, on the day he found out. He found out by accident. He was in his accountant's office reviewing the household accounts during the transition. Separating assets was a process that required going through things he had not examined closely in years, and he found a payment. Small. Made 4 months before he was looking at it. From his wife's personal household budget. A lump sum. To a domestic employment agency. He sat with this information for a moment. He asked his accountant to pull the correspondence. His accountant, who was old enough and wise enough to know when not to ask questions, pulled the correspondence. His wife, for months ago, had engaged an agency to source a replacement domestic worker. The instructions were detailed. They included a timeline. The timeline indicated that Chidinma was to be informed of her termination in 3 months' time. She was to be given 1 month's notice. He put the papers down. He sat in his accountant's office and he thought about a woman who had worked for 6 years in his house and was about to be handed 1 month's notice and sent away. He thought about what 1 month's notice meant against 6 years. Against a mother in a town several hours north. Against a brother whose exam fees had not yet been paid. Against a sister being pressured toward a marriage she did not want. Against 6 years of flat hands on a counter and cracked shoes and a Bible on a wooden table and half a salary sent home every month. He thought about his daughter, who called her Mama Chi. He drove home that afternoon and he asked to speak to Chidinma privately and he told her what he had found. He told her with the same level clarity he used for difficult things. He watched her receive the information. She was very still. The window closed. She put her hands flat on her thighs. Sitting in the chair across from him, hands flat on her thighs, and she looked at the middle distance between them for a moment and she said, "I see. Just that. I see." He told her that the termination was not happening. That her position was secure regardless of what was happening in his marriage. That this was his house too and her employment was his to be part of, and she would not be leaving because of something she had not done. She looked at him then, directly. And what was in her face was something he had not seen there before. Not gratitude, not the careful, measured thank you that was her usual response to anything he gave. Something rawer. Something that had lived under the surface of 6 years and had never found a way up. She nodded once. She looked away. She said, "I need to call my mother." He said, "Of course." She stood and left the room and he sat in his chair in the silence of the afternoon and he thought about what it means to see another human being. Not as a function, not as a background, as a person, specific and full and carrying their own enormous world. He thought about how long it had taken him to do it. He sat with that for a long time. Months passed. The divorce was finalized with a quiet, adult sorrowfulness on both sides and an agreement about their daughter that put her at the center of everything in the way she deserved. They made it work. Not perfectly, but honestly, that was enough. He began to learn his daughter the way he should have learned her from the beginning. Not through photographs and selected moments. In the daily unremarkable minutes, the homework struggles, the nightmare wake-ups, the afternoon silences, the specific way she needed to be held when she was frightened and the different way she needed to be held when she was tired and the entirely different way she needed to be left alone when she was in one of her moods. Chidinma was still there. Still caring for Adiz during the days. Still moving through the house with that economy of motion, though it seemed to him that there was something slightly different in it now. Not the motion of a person navigating a space that was only partly theirs, but something with more purchase. As if she had settled slightly into herself. He had done several things. He had set up an education fund for her brother. Not a grand gesture, a practical arrangement, made through a legal structure, sufficient to cover the exam fees and the university application costs and the first 2 years if the boy earned his place. He had done this without announcement. He had informed Chidinma through a letter from his lawyer. She came to his study door the evening she received the letter. She stood there holding it. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Why?" He said, "Because it is right." She looked at him. She said, "You do not owe my family anything." He said, "I am aware." She stood at the door for another moment. Then she said, "His name is Emeka. My brother. His name is Emeka." He thought about that later, that the boy had his name. For her sister, the one being pressured toward a marriage she did not want, he had done something else. He had asked Chidinma to give him the details of the situation. He had arranged, through a women's foundation his company supported, for a scholarship at a boarding school institution in another state, far enough from the uncle's geography to give the girl time and space and the particular protection of distance. The arrangement had taken 3 months. Chidinma had not known he was pursuing it. When it was confirmed, she sat at the kitchen table with the scholarship letter in front of her, and she did not speak for a very long time. He left her alone. He made tea, which she had taught him to do without knowing she was teaching him, and he put the cup in front of her and went back to his study and left her to whatever she was feeling without requiring her to perform the feeling for him. And now there was this. He had learned, through the accountant, that the house Chidinma's mother lived in, the house in the town several hours north, was not a house Chidinma's mother owned. It was a rental, an arrangement made when the family had arrived in that town many years ago. A landlord who had been, for most of those years, reasonable. A landlord who had recently decided to sell the property. A landlord who had given notice. 60 days. Chidinma had not told him. He had found out because the accountant, reviewing her payroll adjustments, had flagged a request she had put in quietly through the HR records. A request for an advance. A significant advance. The kind of advance that, against her salary, would take years to repay. She had put in the request and then, 2 days later, withdrawn it. He did not know why she had withdrawn it. He could guess. She had withdrawn it because she had decided not to ask. She had been managing the situation herself, in the dark, in the way she managed everything. Quietly, without ceremony, without asking for acknowledgement. She was trying to find a solution to a problem that was larger than her resources could accommodate, and she was trying to do it without burdening anyone. Without asking. He sat with this for 1 day, and then, on a Saturday morning, he told his driver to wait at the end of the road, and he walked the last 5 minutes on a road where the potholes were so deep and so many that the road itself was more hole than road, and he stood outside the gate with a faded number and red dust on his shoes. The voice was singing a church song. He knew it, one of those slow, earnest songs that are about endurance and are sung with the particular weight of people for whom endurance is not a theological concept but a practical daily requirement. The voice was not Chidinma's. It was older and smaller and thinner, and it was coming from inside the house without any awareness of being overheard, which meant it was completely unperformed and therefore completely true. He knocked. There was a pause in the singing. Then footsteps. Then the door opened and he was looking at a woman of perhaps 65 who had Chidinma's bone structure and Chidinma's particular quality of stillness, wearing a wrapper and a blouse and looking at him with the absolutely unimpressed expression of a woman who has lived long enough to be unimpressed by unexpected things. He said, "Good afternoon, Ma. My name is Emeka Adeyemi. Your daughter works for me." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at his dusty shoes. She looked back at his face. And then she stepped aside without a word and let him in. The inside of the house was very small and very clean. That was the first thing. The second thing was that it smelled like the kind of food that takes time, the long, slow smell of something cooking that has been cooking since morning. A 3-burner gas cooker sat on a table in the corner of the room that served as both kitchen and sitting area. The walls had been painted once in a yellow that had gone cream with time. There were 2 chairs and a small wooden table and a television on a stand and 4 wooden dining chairs lined up against the wall, which told him what the table they were waiting for looked like and how long they had been waiting. A boy of perhaps 17 sat at the table with books open in front of him. He looked up when Emeka entered. He had his sister's eyes. He was clearly in the middle of studying, and he had the particular expression of someone who does not want to stop but has enough manners to put down his pen. The woman, Chidinma's mother, offered him the better of the 2 chairs without ceremony. She sat in the other one. She looked at him with a level, patient look and waited. He had not prepared what he was going to say. He had known the address for 3 days and he had not prepared. He sat in the offered chair in his dusty shoes in a house that smelled of slow-cooked food, and he looked at a woman who had raised this daughter and he said, "I came because I want to help. Not because it is business. Because your daughter is the most quietly courageous person I have ever been around, and I have been around her for 6 years without understanding that, and I want to do something right before more time passes." The woman looked at him. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Chidinma does not like people to pity her." He said, "I know. This is not pity. This is correction." Another silence. The cooking smell moved through the room. The boy at the table had picked up his pen again but was clearly not writing. The woman said, "She has carried a lot." He said, "I know. And she has done it without asking me to look." I am choosing to look. Something shifted in the woman's face. It was not the window opening. That was her daughter's expression. It was something else. Something that lived further down, in the place where mothers keep what they know about their children's suffering and cannot fix. A brief, complete acknowledgement, like a thing finally set down. She said, "The house situation." He said, "Yes." She said, "We have 30 more days." He said, "I know." She looked at him again with the unimpressed, undeceived eyes of a woman who has spent 65 years being in the world, and she said, "What do you want from my daughter?" He sat with the question. It was the right question. He had been sitting with versions of it for weeks without asking it of himself with this directness. He said, "I want to help her family have stability, and I want to be honest with her about why." He paused. He said, "And I think I would like to know her. Not the person in my house. The person." The woman looked at him for a very long time. Then she said, "She will be here on Sunday. She comes every Sunday." He said, "I know." He had known for months from small things his daughter had said. Sunday was Chidinma's day off. He stood. He put an envelope on the table without drama. He said it was for the house, not for a rental somewhere else, for a purchase. He had already spoken to a property consultant in this town. There were options. The consultant would contact Chidinma's mother. There would be no debt. There would be no repayment. There would be no advance on any salary. The woman looked at the envelope. She looked at him. She said, "This is too much." He said, "No, Ma. For 6 years of service, it is not enough." She pressed her lips together once. She looked away. The cooking smell kept moving through the room. The boy at the table had completely stopped pretending to write and was looking at him with the open, unguarded attention of a young person who has not yet learned to hide when they are moved. Emeka said goodbye. He shook the woman's hand, and she held his hand for a moment longer than a handshake requires, and in that extra moment there was something complete. He walked to the door. He stepped back into the street where the goat was still watching everything with calm ancient eyes, and the red dust was still on his shoes, and the smell of wood smoke and frying plantain and the unnamed sweetness was still in the air. He walked back toward the end of the road where his driver was waiting. He did not start the engine of himself immediately. He sat in the back of the car for a while, looking at the road ahead, and he felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. Possibly since childhood, possibly since before the ambition and the forward motion and the years of constructing the outer life at the cost of the inner one. Something unclenched. Chidinma came to his study on the Monday after that Sunday. She stood at the door, that door where she had stood so many times in various weathers, and she said, "You went to my mother's house." It was not a question. It was not an accusation. It was the statement of a fact being acknowledged between two people who are now being honest with each other. He said, "Yes." She said, "She called me." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You didn't have to do that." He said, "I know." She said, "Why did you?" He thought about the question. He had thought about it since it was asked to him by her mother with different words. He said, "Because I think I have spent a long time looking at the surface of things and telling myself the surface was enough. And there's a person on the other side of the surface. And I had to account for that." She was quiet. She looked at him directly with the full weight of someone who has learned not to look directly and is choosing to do it anyway. She said, "I want you to know something." He waited. She said, "I have never needed rescue. I need you to understand that. Not because I am proud, but because it is true. My mother's house will be sorted. My brother will sit his exams. My sister will have her scholarship. I would have found a way. I always find a way. What I actually needed for most of these 6 years was to be seen. To have someone in the house I worked in look at me and see a person." He sat with this. She said, "The money helps. I am not going to pretend the money doesn't help. But what I am trying to tell you is that the money is not the thing I am going to remember." He said, "What will you remember?" She said, "The tea." He didn't understand for a moment. Then he did. The evening she had received the scholarship letter for her sister, and he had made tea and put it in front of her and left her alone. The particular gesture of making and leaving, not requiring, not observing, just providing and withdrawing. She said, "I had been crying for about 20 minutes before I heard you in the kitchen. I did not want you to see me." When you brought the tea, I thought you would stay. You didn't. You trusted me to have whatever I needed to have." He said nothing. She said, "That is what I needed. Not to be handled. To be trusted." He looked at her. He thought about all the years and all the surfaces and the particular kind of poverty that is not measured in money. The poverty of being invisible to the people around you, of moving through a life with no one turning to check if you are there. He said, "I am sorry. For the years I wasn't paying attention." She looked at him. She said, "I know. I believe you." And they sat in the study in the quiet of the afternoon, and the window was open and the air that came through it smelled of the garden below. Still young, still establishing itself in the new configuration of his life, and something between them that had been unnamed for a very long time was, in this particular moment, beginning to find its name. Months later, almost a year after the afternoon, he stood outside the gate with red dust on his shoes. Several things were true at once. His daughter Adiz, who was now 6 years old and had recently decided that narrating events was insufficient and she would also be providing editorial commentary, moved between her parents' 2 houses with the flexibility of a person who has been shown that love does not require a single address. She still called Chidinma Mama Chi. She had begun calling Emeka's mother's memory, his mother, who had died before Adiz was born, by a name she had invented herself, which she explained to anyone who would listen was the name for grandmothers you never met but who visit you in your very good dreams. His ex-wife Saad was in a different city doing the architectural work she had always been brilliant at and had subordinated for years to the business of constructing a life that looked correct. She was not happy in the uncomplicated way, but she was honest, which she had come to understand was the precondition for the other kind. They were better for each other as honest adults than they had been as careful spouses. Their daughter was the evidence. Chidinma's brother Emeka, the boy who had shared his name and had been studying with his pen at the table when he walked into that small, clean, cooking-smelling house, had sat his exams and passed with the kind of results that make a teacher go quiet for a moment before saying anything. He had applied to 3 universities. He was waiting for responses with the particular alert patience of a young person on the edge of his life. Chidinma's sister was in her new school, in the boarding house, several hundred kilometers from her uncle and his opinions. She was studying mathematics and had written her sister a letter, a physical letter, handwritten, which Chidinma had read at the kitchen table and which she had not said anything about but which she had kept, folded, in the pocket of her housecoat for 3 days before she put it away. Chidinma's mother was in a house she owned. The same street, the same neighbors, the same goat 2 doors down, though some people said it was a different goat and some people said no, it was the same one because it still had that particular look. The walls were being repainted. She had chosen the color herself, a terracotta, warm and particular, the exact shade of the dry season afternoon light in that town. She had sent Emeka a message through Chidinma. 3 words. God see you. And Emeka himself, Emeka Olusegun Adeyemi, 42 years old now, still building roads and bridges and hospitals and towers, still the man whose name appeared on lists, sat in his apartment one evening with a cup of tea he had made himself, and he looked out at the city below and he thought about a kind of wealth that is not measured in the units he had spent his life accumulating. He thought about what it costs to see another person. Really see them. Not the version of them that is useful to your life. Not the surface that functions. The actual person, in their fullness, with their quiet courage and their flat hands on counters at midnight and their cracked shoes and their Bible on a wooden table and all the things they are carrying that they will never ask you to help with unless you choose, deliberately and actively, to look. He thought about how many people are in that position. Not in some abstract, distant sense. In every house. In every office. In every space where one person's comfort is maintained by another person's labor. How many quiet, specific, irreplaceable people are made invisible by the inattention of the people around them. He sat with this for a long time. Then he picked up his phone and he called Chidinma because they had arrived, slowly, carefully, and with the full weight of honesty it required, at the place where calling was a simple and natural thing. She picked up. She said his name. And the specific way she said it, the particular quality of it, the way it sounded when a person says your name and means it, was, in its own quiet way, the most expensive thing he had ever been given. There is something this story wants to leave with you before it lets you go. It wants to say that visibility is not a small thing. We talk about love, about sacrifice, about loyalty, about all the large named emotions that make stories worth telling. But underneath all of them, invisible and essential the way foundations are invisible and essential, is the smaller thing. The act of turning to look. The act of seeing another person as full and specific and real, not as a role they fill in the story of your life, but as someone who has their own story, complete and complicated, that you have not yet heard. Chidinma was not rescued. She would be the first to tell you, and she has told you. She was seen. And being seen by the right person at the right moment, after years of being invisible, does something in a person that no amount of money can replicate. Says you are here. You are real. You count. The world is not indifferent to you, even when it has behaved as if it is. The second thing this story wants to say is that it is never too late to look. Emeka spent 6 years looking past a person who was right in front of him every day. And then he looked, and what he found was not the background, not the function, a human being in full carrying an enormous world quietly without complaint because that was what was required. It is never too late to look. But the earlier you do it, the less you have to account for when the looking finally comes. And the third thing, the last and perhaps the most important thing, is this. The people who make your daily life possible, who clean the spaces you move through, who care for the children you love, who cook the food that sustains you, who do the work that the rest of the world does not see. These people are not background. They are not infrastructure. They are specific, full, irreplaceable human beings. And the way you see them, or fail to see them, says something precise and unavoidable about who you are. We are all, at various moments, the person doing the invisible work. And we are all, at various moments, the person who could be looking. The question is which one you are choosing to be right now. And so I leave you with this. Think of the person in your life who moves through your world quietly, who shows up, who does the work, who carries things without being asked about the weight of it. Think of when you last truly looked at them, not past them, at them. When did you last see the person behind the function? And if you looked right now, today, what do you think you would find?